Societies and nations tend to think of themselves as eternal, but they also cherish tales of their origin. A special feature of Chinese civilization is that it seems to have no beginning. It appears in history less as a conventional empire, nation, or state than a permanent phenomenon, natural almost. Unlike in the tale of, say, Romulus or America's founding fathers who create a state out of a collection of people, in the story of the Yellow Emperor, revered by many Chinese as the legendary founding ruler, China already exists. When the Yellow Emperor appears in myth, Chinese civilization has fallen into chaos. Competing princes harass each other and the people, and an enfeebled ruler fails to maintain order. Rising up with an army, the new hero pacifies the realm and is acclaimed as emperor. The Yellow Emperor has gone down in history as a founding hero, yet in the founding myth, he is re-establishing, not creating, an empire. China predated him. In its historical consciousness, China is an established state requiring only restoration, not creation. And this myth is actually partly based on historical fact. In some ways, China is the political entity that has survived for the longest period of time with a relatively stable core territory and borders. We can find evidence of a Chinese state in the 3rd millennium BCE, and the first Chinese dynasty whose existence is confirmed by archaeological evidence dates back to the 2nd millennium. From that date onward, the history of the Chinese state is the history of the rise and fall of dynasties, according to what historians have defined as the Chinese dynastic cycle. According to this worldview, which was dominant for millennia in Chinese scholarship, every dynasty begins by overthrowing the previous dynasty that has grown decadent, weak, and corrupt, returning order and virtue to a country beset by foreign invasions and internal rebellions. In the first period of its rule, the new dynasty is inspired to regain the glory and prestige that China had lost under the previous dynasty, expanding the borders, pacifying the barbarians, and bringing harmony to all that is under heaven. After each collapse, the Chinese state reconstituted itself as if by some immutable law of nature. At each stage, a new uniting figure emerged, following essentially the president of the Yellow Emperor, to subdue his rivals and reunify China, and sometimes enlarge its territory. In Chinese cosmology, the emperor is the mediator between the earthly realm and the spiritual realm, the sky or heaven. His duty is to rule according to a mandate given to him by the will of the universe itself, on the basis of his virtue and ability. If he rules justly according to the universal laws of morality, his reign is surely successful. After a period of successful rule, the dynasty would begin to decay. Wealth and not morality would become the arbiter of human relations. Corruption would grow, and officials would oppress the people. Natural disasters would hit the empire. Barbarians invaded, causing devastation and death, and this would be seen as proof that the ruler and the dynasty had lost the mandate and the right to rule. Ever-increasing rebellions would then fracture territorial unity of the empire until one of the contenders would pacify the country and establish a new dynasty. This is obviously a conservative and cyclical view of history and the world. It accepts the right to rebel against oppressive rule, but not the right to radically change the system. And it proclaims that while a new dynasty can reclaim some of the glory that China possessed under its mythical founders, it can never surpass or even reach those same heights again. This idolized cycle repeated itself many times throughout the history of China, uninterrupted even by foreign invasions. The Roman Empire fractured and never returned under invasion. But when the Chinese Empire was invaded, the foreign rulers always found it preferable to adopt the ways of the conquered to some degree. When in the early 17th century the Ming dynasty was collapsing on itself, a series of ambitious neighboring leaders used the opportunity to establish a new dynasty. From the northeast, the northeastern nomadic Jurchen tribes, newly united under the leader Nurhaci, started to carve out a kingdom from the Chinese lands beyond the Great Wall. In 1618, they took Fushun, and in 1621, they took Liaoyang and what would become their capital, Mukden. Nurhaci resurrected the ancient Chinese Manchu state of Jin and began to threaten core Chinese lands. To improve the organization of his nomadic armies, he created the banner system, which placed every Manchu man in a military unit that managed taxation, conscription, and mobilization. Initially, there were 8 Manchu banners, and later 8 Mongol and 8 Chinese banners were added. After Nurhaci died, his son Abahai directed the Manchu subjugation of Korea, breached the Great Wall, and set up a government structure that was identical to that of the Ming Empire. In 1836, he also proclaimed the rise of a new dynasty, the imperial Qing dynasty. In 1643, he died, being succeeded by a 6-year-old Lin. But this was not to save the Ming. The rebel general Li Zucheng entered Beijing in April of 1644, and the last Ming emperor hanged himself. Manchu troops poured through the Great Wall, and Li escaped Beijing, which fell to the Manchu forces in June. In October, the court moved to Beijing, and the boy Fu Lin became the second Qing emperor of China, adopting the reign title of Shunzhi. The Manchus advanced south extremely quickly, and thus had to rely on Chinese collaborators for their survival. The new dynasty survived by maintaining a tenuous balance of power among three components of its state. First were the Manchus themselves, the former Jurchen, but their own language, religion, and their own aristocratic rankings based on earlier Jurchen connections or on descent from Nurhaci. Second came the other bannermen, both Mongols and Chinese, who spoke both Manchu and Chinese. Third came the ethnic Chinese, usually the Han, raised in China proper. This system is what has been called the Manchu Chinese diarchy, and some authors actually include the Mongols as well, and so call it a synarchy or a triarchy. Upper class status in China itself was not the same as in the Manchu lands. It came from a combination of 4 factors: wealth, lineage, and education. Wealth was mostly valued in land and silver. Lineages, sometimes called clans or common descent groups, bound extended families together in a network of mutual support. A certain amount of wealth might be pooled and transmitted to later generations in the form of lineage land, the income from which would pay for the upkeep of ancestral temples and graveyards, and for teachers who served as instructors in lineage schools. From infancy, boys and girls were trained to observe the proper familial relationships, especially filial piety. The three bonds, Sangang, of the classical teaching were authoritarian, enjoining obedience to parents, subordination of wives to husbands, and loyalty of subject to ruler. This could basically be considered the most basic tenet of Confucianism. The hierarchy of status within the nuclear family was only part, however, of the kinship network that extended out into the lineage networks. The full import of this subordination of individual to family structure is not easy for us to comprehend today. So absolute were the paternal authority and the virtue of filial obedience that a son who disobeyed parental instructions could be punished and even killed by his father with legal impunity, unless the killing were to be held as inhumane. The state thus delegated many of the responsibilities that it would end up taking on in the West, in the realm of justice and the maintenance of social order, letting the lineages police themselves to avoid trouble with the state authorities. Power and prestige was attached to holding office in the bureaucracy, entrance into which was governed almost entirely through competitive examination run by the state. In normal times, few people rose to high office via a military career, and surprisingly few just because their families had money or imperial connections, even though one could simply just buy academic degrees. Education, thus, was a fundamental prerequisite for success in society, though the way candidates were chosen or rejected through the brutally competitive examinations ensured that many well-educated and talented men would grow disillusioned with the system. The failed exam candidate became somewhat of a classical social figure, protagonist of melancholic poems on paper, and leader of rebellion in the real world. Successful education, however, largely depended on wealth, and access to the bureaucracy meant wealth as well. It was possible in a few years of office holding to make enough money from salaries, perquisites, special fees, and perhaps outright graft and corruption to repay all the costs one had incurred in obtaining the position, and retain a hefty surplus to invest in more land and educating one's own children. A wealthy and organized lineage network would aid immensely in all these operations. So, while China lacked a Western-style aristocracy of blood, and the imperial system afforded a higher degree of social mobility than could be possible in many European monarchies, at least until much later in history, a Chinese ruling class did exist. This was called sometimes the gentry. This class was bound together by land ownership and a common cultural set of values, ideology, and experiences. In the empire, these elites practiced local self-management within a greater state that wasn't a national entity yet, but in which the gentry felt a common bond that generally kept the whole political structure together. We do not have time to go through in detail the reign of every Qing emperor, but we will quickly describe the reigns of the successive emperors so that we know what's going on, and then we'll go into more detail in successive occasions. The third Qing emperor, Kangxi, was the longest officially reigning emperor in Chinese history, and his reign was most impressive for the restoration of stability to the empire. The three semi-independent Han Chinese vassal states to the south, the three feudatories that had rebelled against the Ming and had declared their fealty to the Qing, were destroyed and absorbed into the state. Taiwan, which was under the rule of a Ming loyalist exile kingdom, was conquered. Mongolian princes were pacified. These successes were possible thanks to the military system of the Qing Empire, which emphasized the Manchu Chinese diarchy. The imperial troops themselves were organized into the 8 banners, but the sheer number of Ming military forces that had defected to the Qing during the rapid conquest made it impossible to absorb them into the banner system, like it had been done with the Chinese who had lived outside the Great Wall. So a parallel army structure was created, called the Green Standard Army, which was not only much larger than the banner armies, but also came to surpass the banners in quality during Kangxi's reign. Importantly, a treaty was signed with Russia after the two empires' first border skirmishes in Siberia. The Treaty of Nerchinsk of 1689 not only validated a Chinese victory in the military realm over Russia, but also was one of China's first real acts of diplomacy within the Western system of international relations. The treaty was negotiated with the help of Jesuit advisors to the Chinese court, who Kangxi had been nurturing relations with in hopes of acquiring Western knowledge of science. Kangxi also spends considerable efforts in wooing Chinese officials to his policies, as he knew that their support was invaluable to run the country efficiently. Special examinations were held, and Kangxi lost no chances to outwardly display his fondness for Chinese learning. The emperor also believed that China's prosperity was measured by the size of its population, and the true size of that population was being hidden by local officials who feared that if they reported rising numbers of people, the Ministry of Revenue would respond by raising their tax payments, which was how the system worked. So, in 1712, he froze the assessments of able-bodied men registered as working a given area of agricultural land, and decreed that however much the population increased in a particular area, the state would not raise that area's taxes. Local officials could thus report population increases accurately without fearing the burden of a raised assessment at a future date. This helped to gain the loyalty of the bureaucracy, but it seriously hampered the state's prospect of increasing tax revenues in the future. This was a major issue. China always had problems with taxes, and these are problems that still plague the country in some ways to this day. Since the empire is effectively a continent, keeping a centralized fiscal control is very, very difficult, which results in effective decentralization in both revenues and expenses, because the central government cannot control the officials anyway. So, while Kangxi's reign helped consolidate the empire and gave China a period of peace and stability to reconstruct the economy, the state did not profit from this. In addition, the expensive military campaigns that were embarked upon by the state during this period left a dangerous precedent. While at the emperor's death the treasury was richer than at the beginning of the reign, the revenue hadn't significantly increased. While the empire's size had, the empire was much larger now. Qing willingness to embark on large military expeditions to the frontiers and in the interior, such as those in Kangxi's reign against Russia, Mongolia, Tibet, and the suppression of the internal rebellions, such as the Three Feudatories, would continue to be a large sink of silver in the future. His successor, Yongzheng, started with a succession crisis, but he ascended to the throne as an adult, experienced in the ways of the court. Though his reign was short, he managed to overhaul the tax system, the bureaucracy, and the intelligence, and also encourage migration and colonization of Taiwan. Emperor Yongzheng's interests took on more than matters of administration. He had a far-ranging concern for moral, cultural, today we would say ideological values, and many of his major decisions were affected by his moral convictions. The emperor elaborated on each of his father's, aka Kangxi's, maxims at great lengths, preparing lectures that were to be delivered by local scholars twice a month down to the villages. In his elaborations, Yongzheng especially emphasized the need for integrated local communities that would pay their taxes promptly, avoid feuds, and protect themselves from outlaws. The role of thrift and hard work in an agricultural economy was also to be extolled. His control over officials was tight and autocratic. Enforcement of law was carried out inexorably and vigorously, and spies were sent all over the empire to inform on officials' dereliction of duties and on any kind of trouble that was brewing. In a new area, opium addiction, the emperor was on new and untested terrain. Although some use of opium for its medicinal and narcotic properties had been recorded since the 11th century in China, it was only after tobacco smoking had become popular during the 17th century and after knowledge of opium smoking had been brought back from Taiwan, from soldiers that had been sent there to suppress a rebellion in the 1720s, that opium addiction spread to the Chinese mainland. Yongzheng's efforts to stabilize the empire also spilled over into foreign policy. The Treaty of Nerchinsk with Russia had not settled the boundary between Siberia and Outer Mongolia, only with Manchuria. In the western border areas, there existed a last vestige of Mongol power, the Dzungar Khanate. The Manchus and the Chinese leadership feared that the Russians and this remaining Mongol threat could join forces against the empire. Because of this potential threat, Yongzheng was anxious to settle all the pending issues with Russia via a new agreement. The resultant Treaty of Kyakhta of 1727 secured for China a clear delineation of the Mongolian-Siberian frontier, while Russia gained territorial concessions of nearly 40,000 square miles between the upper Irtysh and the Sayan mountains, as well as land south and southwest of Lake Baikal. In addition, Russia was granted trade privileges and the permission to establish a religious mission in Beijing, something which other European powers would have to seriously fight for later down the line. The rise and consolidation of the Qing Empire, like for many other dynasties, represent a period of great economic development and rebirth of an economy that had been destroyed during the decline of the previous dynasty. It is thus important to understand, to sort of see the mechanics of economic development in China as a whole, however, in pre-modern China. However, the Qing Empire, being China's last imperial dynasty, also represents a unique case study for what happens when a pre-modern China is rising to a modern economic system, and all of the problems and frictions and conflicts that can arise from it. So next time, we're going to be taking a look at that economic system, economic development during the rise of the Qing Empire, and its consequences later down the line, which we will explore in successive videos.